1891, Peru. Each generation was born without a voice, the Ayacucho Silence Study. In the highlands of Peru, 1891, there was a village that no map wanted to claim. Ayacucho sat perched among jagged mountains, shrouded in mist and secrets. Travelers described it as beautiful, yet eerie, a place where the wind seemed to carry hushed voices, though no one ever spoke. From the outside, it looked like any other Andean settlement. Stone cottages clustered along narrow dirt paths, children chasing goats through the morning fog, and the smell of firewood and maize drifting from kitchens. But there was something wrong, something no visitor could ignore. Every child born in Ayacucho came into the world without a voice. Not a whisper, not a cry. Silence, thick and unbroken, filled the village. Parents learned to communicate with gestures, drawings, and an intricate system of hand signals. But the silence weighed heavy on every home. A mother would cradle her newborn, lips moving in desperate, soundless words, and the baby would stare with wide, uncomprehending eyes. It was as if the mountains themselves had stolen their voices before they even had a chance to speak. Stories spread of the first generation lost to silence. Old villagers whispered that it began decades earlier, with a single child who never uttered sound. That child grew, married, and passed the same quiet curse to her own children. By 1891, the silence had woven itself into every family. Parents became teachers of gestures, midwives became translators of emotions, and the town existed in a quiet world unlike any other. The outside world barely noticed. Travelers assumed the villagers were shy or strangely reserved. Some dismissed it as superstition. Others reported back, wide-eyed, that children did not scream when burned, did not cry when hungry, and did not shout and play. The silence was complete, and it unsettled everyone who witnessed it. Yet, the villagers adapted in ways outsiders could not imagine. Markets moved with hand signals. Festivals were choreographed dances of expression. Music existed only in the beating of drums or the plucking of strings, while voices remained absent. Parents developed their own signs for every need: food, water, sickness, or danger. Life went on, but it was a life defined by what could not be heard. Rumors, though, had a way of creeping through the Andes like mist. Some said the silence was a punishment from God. Others whispered of a curse that no healer could lift. And a few, always the cautious few, suspected it was something in the air, the water, or the soil itself. Whatever the cause, it created a world that outsiders could not enter, a world where sound existed only in memory or imagination. By the time scholars and doctors heard of Ayacucho, the village had already earned a reputation as a place of haunting beauty and impossible tragedy. Visitors noted the eerie calm of children playing. They watched mothers attempt to soothe their babies with hands instead of words, and they left with a shiver, unable to shake the silence that clung to every corner of the town. Even within the village, life was not peaceful. Families grieved quietly, and love was expressed through touch and gaze rather than words. Arguments ended in tense gestures. Joy came slowly, carefully measured. And through it all, the mountains seemed to listen, keeping secrets the villagers themselves could not understand. The Ayacucho silence was not just an absence of sound. It was a presence, heavy and persistent, shaping the minds and hearts of every generation. To live, there was to live with a question that had no answer, a haunting truth that no one could speak aloud. And yet, despite the isolation Ayacucho endured, families survived. Children grew. The village thrived in its own strange way, suspended between mystery and reality, between a curse and a miracle. The world outside remained unaware, while the town whispered silently to itself, hiding its dark secret in plain sight. No one knew exactly when the silence began. The elders spoke of the first child born without a voice, decades before 1891, a girl whose parents' whispers became prayers. Some claimed she was cursed. Others said she had been marked by the mountains themselves. Her name was lost to time, but her legacy endured in every home, every cradle, every quiet corner of Ayacucho. By the late 1800s, the pattern was undeniable. Entire families, generation after generation, produced children who could not speak. Fathers who had once been vibrant and loud grew silent alongside their children. Mothers who had sung lullabies now moved their lips in silence. The village became a living puzzle, a riddle that no one outside could solve, and the people inside could not explain. Scholars and doctors began to take notice. Letters arrived in Lima describing this silent village high in the Andes. Some dismissed it as exaggeration or superstition, but curiosity drove others. Anthropologists and physicians embarked on arduous journeys through narrow mountain passes, climbing steep cliffs and crossing icy rivers, hoping to uncover the truth. When they arrived, they were struck first by the normalcy of the village and then by its impossible secret. Children ran through the streets, laughing silently, shouting only in gestures. Parents nodded or shook their heads instead of speaking. Even the marketplace functioned through sign language alone. Scholars were baffled. How could an entire town, untouched by war or famine, remain mute through generations? Early hypotheses emerged. Some suggested a genetic mutation, passed down like an invisible chain through bloodlines. Others whispered of environmental factors, contaminated water, strange herbs, or a rare mineral in the mountains that affected speech. There were even darker theories, a family curse, divine punishment, or the work of some forgotten spirit. Each explanation carried its own weight of fear and fascination. Families themselves told stories in whispers. Some blamed ancestors who had angered the gods. Others spoke of a sickness that had struck the village long ago, muting children but leaving adults' minds intact. These tales, repeated year after year, became legend, woven into the culture of Ayacucho. Silence was no longer just an absence. It was a narrative, a defining element of identity, and a source of fear and pride all at once. Doctors attempted experiments, though they were crude by modern standards. They observed children from dawn to dusk, noting every motion, every reaction. They recorded how families communicated through gestures, facial expressions, and written symbols. Some scientists even attempted to induce speech through repetitive exercises, forcing children to utter sounds in isolation. But the silence held. It was absolute. The villagers watched outsiders with suspicion. They had seen travelers arrive with curiosity in their eyes and leave with confusion, frustration, or fear. Some scholars left notebooks filled with observations, never to return. Others documented families' histories in painstaking detail, recording births, marriages, and deaths, hoping to find a pattern that explained the impossible. Yet, despite every effort, the mystery deepened. And still, the question lingered. Was it a curse, a miracle, or something science had not yet understood? No one could say. The silence refused to be explained, resisting every attempt at comprehension. It was as if Ayacucho itself had drawn a line in the mountains, separating the world of sound from its own hidden, hushed reality. Through it all, life in Ayacucho persisted. Families adapted. Children learned to play, to express anger, to celebrate, and to mourn, all without a voice. And while outsiders searched for answers, the villagers continued their quiet existence, carrying forward a secret that no words could ever fully capture. The mountains watched, the wind whispered, and the silence endured, stubborn, unbroken, haunting anyone who dared to study it. Childhood in Ayacucho was a world apart. Imagine being born into a life where no one could tell you your name aloud, where the first cries that should welcome you into the world never came. Parents would cradle newborns close, moving their lips, humming silently, tracing patterns in the air that the baby would watch with wide, searching eyes. Sound was a memory whispered from stories, not an experience. Children learned early that gestures were language. A simple wave could mean hello or goodbye. A hand pressed to the chest could signal love, and a pointed finger could demand attention. Families developed a complex system of signs, passed down through generations. To an outsider, it might seem like a game. To those who lived it, it was survival. But childhood in Ayacucho was not easy. Laughter existed, but it was quiet, a movement of the mouth without sound. Tears fell, but they were unaccompanied by wails. When scraped knees or bruised elbows cried for comfort, the world responded with gentle hands, whispered prayers, and soothing gestures. The village adapted, but the emptiness of voice weighed on every heart. School was another challenge entirely. Lessons were delivered not by words, but by demonstrations and written symbols. Teachers, often parents themselves, became masters of pantomime. Children memorized everything by watching, touching, and mimicking. Every success was celebrated with a wave or a nod, every failure marked with a solemn, silent correction. The learning was rigorous, but every child adapted, becoming fluent in this quiet, expressive language. Playtime revealed both beauty and sorrow. Children ran through the mountainside fields, their hands waving and spinning, mimicking songs they could not hear, dancing to rhythms that existed only in their imagination. Games were lively, but always muted. Tag, hide and seek, or racing goats. All were played with gestures instead of shouts. Joy existed, but it was contained within the limits of silence. The psychological toll, however, was profound. Many children grew up with a sense of isolation, even among family. They understood the world differently, perceiving danger, love, anger, and sadness not through sound, but through observation and intuition. Friendships were formed through gestures, eye contact, and shared experience. Words, the bridge to the outside world, were denied to them. Illness brought another kind of fear. When a child became sick, there was no way to call for help with a shout. Parents relied on close observation, subtle signs, and a profound understanding of their child's body and expressions. The smallest cough, the faintest grimace, could mean the difference between life and death. In this quiet existence, attention to detail was survival. Yet, amidst the struggle, moments of pure tenderness emerged. A mother tracing shapes on her child's back, a father lifting his son into the morning light, a village gathering where hands intertwined in celebration. All these acts carried immense emotional weight. Love and care were expressed in ways the outside world could barely comprehend. Even the older children, those approaching adolescence, felt the world's impossibility. They learned to negotiate markets, to ask favors, to plead for understanding, all without words. Visitors were confusing, often frightening, because they spoke in sounds that the villagers could not produce. Communication became an art form, a dance of the body, eyes, and hands, rich in nuance, but impossible for the uninitiated to decipher. In Ayacucho, childhood was a study in resilience. It was a life shaped not by the absence of play, learning, or love, but by the absence of voice. Every gesture, every look, every small movement carried weight and meaning. And through this silent upbringing, children grew into adults who could navigate a world without words, carrying forward the mystery of Ayacucho generation after generation. Word of Ayacucho's silent generations had reached Lima and beyond. By 1891, curious physicians, anthropologists, and scholars began the arduous journey into the high Andes. Their motives varied. Some were driven by science, others by curiosity, and a few by the hope of discovering a miracle. None were prepared for what they would find. The trek itself was punishing. Narrow, rocky paths wound between jagged peaks, icy rivers cut across their route, and sudden storms could trap travelers for days. Letters sent ahead warned of the village's strange reputation, a place where children were born without voices, where families communicated through gestures and eye contact alone. Many dismissed the warnings as superstition, but the determination to study the phenomenon pushed them forward. When they arrived, the first impressions were disorienting. The village appeared lively at a glance. Children playing, women carrying baskets, men tending flocks, but there was no sound. No cries of children, no shouts from the marketplace, no music from the plaza. Only movement. Scholars felt a chill as the realization sank in. Here, communication had taken an entirely different form. Doctors began systematic observations. They watched families from dawn until dusk, noting how parents communicated with infants and how children interacted with each other. They recorded gestures, facial expressions, and even subtle movements of the eyes and hands. Every interaction revealed the intricacy of a silent language passed down through generations. The scholars also sought to understand the origins of the phenomenon. They questioned villagers, relying on interpreters or hand signals, tracing family histories as far back as possible. Patterns emerged. Silence was nearly universal, appearing in nearly every family line. Some children had slightly stronger vocal abilities, but even they could not form words. Researchers were puzzled. Was this hereditary, environmental, or was something else entirely? Medical examinations began cautiously. Doctors tested reflexes, lungs, and the vocal cords of children and adults. Nothing appeared abnormal. Physically, the villagers seemed capable of speech. Yet, the silence persisted. It was as if a block existed somewhere deeper, beyond anatomy or medicine, lodged in the body or mind in ways science could not penetrate. As weeks passed, scholars documented the villagers' adaptation. Markets were run entirely through gestures. Church ceremonies were silent except for the soft tapping of drums. Education was conducted through demonstration and imitation. Every day revealed new layers of ingenuity, but also deep tragedy. For all their cleverness, the villagers lived with limitations that outsiders could hardly imagine. Some doctors tried experimental methods. Repetitive vocal exercises, attempts at mimicry, and auditory stimulation were introduced, yet they failed. Children could move lips and tongue correctly, but no sound emerged. Parents, protective and wary, sometimes grew hostile, fearing that outsiders' experiments would harm their children. The scholars were fascinated and unsettled. They noted the emotional toll of the silence. Grief expressed without tears or cries, joy without laughter, anger without voice. They realized that Ayacucho's mystery was not just physical, but psychological and cultural. The silence shaped every facet of life, from family bonds to social structure, creating a society unlike any other. Reports from the village were sent back to Lima and beyond, filled with meticulous notes, sketches, and observations. Scientists debated endlessly. Was it a hereditary anomaly, a local disease, or a lingering curse? None could agree. The silence resisted every attempt at explanation, remaining stubbornly, hauntingly absolute. And while the outsiders left eventually, many carried with them a sense of awe and dread. Ayacucho was no longer just a village. It was a puzzle, a living enigma that challenged understanding of speech, genetics, and human adaptation. The quiet mountains had revealed a truth few could speak of, and even fewer could ever fully grasp. In Ayacucho, the church stood at the village's heart, a stone structure weathered by wind and time. From the outside, it looked like any Andean chapel. Arched doorways, small bell tower, and wooden benches lined in solemn rows. But inside, it told a story the world could not hear. The villagers attended Mass, but unlike any church elsewhere, there was no choir, no singing of hymns, no spoken prayers. Only silence. Priests spoke softly, but their words were met with gestures, nods, and the occasional trembling hand. Candlelight flickered across faces, illuminating expressions of devotion, fear, and awe. Even in worship, the absence of voice was tangible. Superstition thrived in the shadows of the church. Some villagers whispered that the silence was a punishment from God, a divine decree passed down through generations. Others feared the wrath of spirits who had claimed the voices of the innocent. Parents told children that noise might anger the mountains themselves. Every gesture, every glance, became part of a ritual meant to honor the unseen forces that governed their lives. Priests, too, were perplexed. They tried to teach the villagers prayers, guiding hands across the pages of the Bible. But the words never left the lips of the congregation. Instead, prayers were shaped in the air, hands clasped, fingers interlaced, eyes closed in deep concentration. Outsiders watched, bewildered by the solemnity and intensity of silent devotion. Confession was a delicate ritual. Villagers could not speak their sins aloud, so the priest relied on written notes or gestures to understand the confessions. Some secrets remained locked away, known only to the confessor and God. The absence of sound added weight to the words, making every gesture more meaningful, more haunting, more permanent. Even church festivals were altered. Processions moved through the village with drums and bells, but no chants or songs. Children paraded with painted faces and ribbons, their motions carefully synchronized to express celebration. Joy existed, but it was silent, haunting, almost spectral. The entire community participated in rituals that outsiders could barely comprehend. Yet to the villagers, these were lifelines, threads connecting them to the divine and to each other. The church became a repository of fear and hope. Villagers prayed silently for children to survive, for crops to grow, for the curse to lift. Every gesture was imbued with meaning, every glance a prayer, every movement a plea for understanding from a world they could not join in speech. Some travelers wrote of the eerie power of the church. They described a quiet so profound it seemed to echo, a stillness that pressed against the soul. One observer noted that the silence itself felt sacred, a presence as heavy as the stone walls, as old as the mountains. In this sacred hush, the mystery of Ayacucho deepened. The silence was not just absence. It was a force shaping faith, obedience, and fear. It tied generations together, binding families to rituals, to stories, to the rhythms of a life defined by what could not be spoken. Even as outsiders debated curses, diseases, or genetics, the villagers looked to the church for answers. Hands lifted in prayer, eyes fixed on flickering candles, hearts heavy with unspoken pleas. And though the mystery persisted, the church remained a place where silence was sacred, where whispers in the mind were louder than voices ever could be. By the turn of the century, whispers of Ayacucho's silent children had reached the scientific journals of Lima and even Europe. Physicians and geneticists began to wonder, could silence be inherited? Was there a hereditary flaw hidden deep in the village bloodlines? The mystery had moved beyond superstition. It demanded a scientific lens. Researchers traced family trees with painstaking care. Midwives and elders provided details of births dating back decades. Entire generations had passed without a single child uttering a word. Patterns emerged. Nearly every family produced silent children, sometimes skipping a generation, but never completely breaking the cycle. To scientists, this was more than coincidence. It was a puzzle that defied explanation. Early genetic theories were rudimentary, relying on observation rather than laboratory analysis. Doctors suggested that a recessive trait might be responsible, a gene carried silently through parents but expressed fully in their offspring. Some proposed that intermarriage within the small village had concentrated the trait over generations. Others speculated that the mountain's isolation had created a closed genetic loop, amplifying the anomaly. Field studies brought mixed results. Children appeared healthy, with no visible deformities, no neurological impairments, and functioning vocal cords. Physically, they should have been able to speak. Yet when asked, or rather, gestured to, none produced sound. It was as if a switch had been removed at birth, an invisible barrier that blocked the act of speaking without altering the body. Villagers themselves offered stories of silent ancestors. They spoke, in gestures and written notes, of grandparents and great-grandparents who had also been mute, describing the anguish and adaptation of generations. Yet, despite centuries of observation, no one could pinpoint the source. Even families with the clearest histories could only speculate. Was it divine punishment, disease, or something woven into their blood? Attempts at early treatment or intervention failed. Some doctors tried vibration exercises, forcing children to imitate sounds made by instruments. Others experimented with diet, herbal remedies, and even rituals meant to wake the voice. Every approach failed. The silence persisted, unyielding, as though nature itself had marked these children in a way science could not reverse. The village's isolation amplified the puzzle. Marriages within the community were common, which may have strengthened the hereditary pattern. Yet even children born to one parent from Ayacucho and one outsider often displayed the same muteness. The phenomenon was stubborn, defying simple explanations of inheritance or environment. By 1910, genetic theories gained more traction in scientific circles. Some European researchers cited Ayacucho as a potential case study in inherited silence. Yet the lack of laboratory tools made conclusions impossible. Blood tests, DNA sequencing, these were decades away. For now, the mystery remained. A quiet village in the Andes held a secret that could not be explained by contemporary science. And while outsiders debated genes and recessive traits, the villagers themselves continued their lives. They raised children, cultivated crops, celebrated marriages, and mourned deaths, all without voices. The genetic puzzle remained unsolved, but it shaped the destiny of every family, reinforcing the idea that silence was not just absence but inheritance, a legacy as real and binding as blood. The mountains watched, the wind whispered, and the generations of Ayacucho moved through a world where sound was a stranger and science was only beginning to knock at the door. Life in Ayacucho was a quiet endurance, but even in silence, human emotions ran deep. Love existed, yet it was expressed not in words but in gestures, glances, and touch. Courtship was a delicate dance. A simple brush of hands, a shared glance, a small gift. These were the confessions of the heart. In a village without voices, every act of affection carried weight far beyond what sound could convey. Romance, however, was fraught with difficulty. Couples could not whisper sweet words in the night or confess fears with spoken reassurance. Misunderstandings were common, resolved only through painstaking gestures or the intervention of relatives. Marriages were often arranged or guided by tradition, as the inability to speak made the negotiation of desires and emotions precarious. Yet love found a way. Families adapted, developing intricate systems of communication that allowed intimacy to exist in the quiet. Loss was an even heavier burden. Funerals were silent ceremonies, tears falling in unison but without spoken eulogies. Grief was performed in gestures, a hand pressed to the chest, a bowed head, a lingering touch. Mothers mourned children they could not comfort with lullabies. Fathers mourned sons and daughters they could not praise with words. Every sorrow was doubled, both by the tragedy itself and by the silence that made it impossible to express fully. Isolation shaped every life. Children grew up knowing they were different from the outside world, that their inability to speak set them apart. Travelers, merchants, and scholars passed through, marveling at their silent ways, yet leaving behind a world that spoke in sounds they could never replicate. The villagers became inward-looking, developing a culture of careful observation, subtlety, and patience. Social bonds were intense, but they existed largely within the village, insulated from outsiders. Friendships and family relationships became lifelines. Siblings learned to read each other's expressions with uncanny precision. Parents could discern the smallest changes in posture or eye movement to detect illness, emotion, or desire. The silence, while isolating, also forged a deep, almost telepathic connection between people. They communicated not through words, but through presence, touch, and shared understanding. Yet the absence of voice could also breed tension. Frustration and anger were contained within gestures, sometimes escalating into physical disputes or long-lasting resentment. Apologies were expressed through prolonged gestures or acts of service, but misunderstandings lingered longer than in the world of speech. Life required constant patience, a careful reading of signals, and a level of empathy that outsiders could scarcely imagine. In matters of love and family, the silence took on a ritualistic quality. Courtship, marriage, child-rearing, and mourning were all performed as if the village itself had agreed on an unspoken script. Gestures became language, movements became poetry, and touch became the medium of memory and desire. Every act of intimacy or care was amplified, carrying meanings that would be lost in a world of sound. Despite these challenges, the villagers endured. Children grew into adults who understood the rhythms of silence, who could navigate emotion, danger, and community without a word. They formed bonds as strong as any spoken promises, and they learned to love, grieve, and connect in ways that were uniquely their own. The mountains enveloped them, the winds carried no words, and the world outside remained unaware. Within this quiet world, love, loss, and isolation were inseparable. The silence shaped the heart as much as the mind, creating a generation defined not by voice, but by resilience, intimacy, and the unspoken truths that bound them together. As the mystery of Ayacucho persisted, some outsiders began to suspect that the silence was not hereditary or divine. It might be the result of an unseen disease. Scholars speculated that a local epidemic, long forgotten, could have left its mark on generations of children. Perhaps a virus, a bacterial infection, or even environmental toxins had disrupted the ability to speak before birth. Reports circulated of similar phenomena in remote villages, though none matched Ayacucho's scale. Some scientists suggested that high-altitude conditions or water contamination might have affected fetal development, silencing newborns before they could cry. Others pointed to nutritional deficiencies, parasites, or long-term exposure to mysterious minerals in the mountains. Every hypothesis seemed plausible yet fell short under scrutiny. Villagers themselves told fragmented stories. Elders whispered of sickness that had swept through the community decades earlier, striking infants with fever, convulsions, or death. Some survivors were left mute, a condition that, over generations, appeared to become hereditary. Yet no one could verify these accounts. Memories were fragmented and written records scarce. The line between fact and legend blurred. Doctors attempted to investigate further. They tested water sources, examined local herbs, and studied dietary habits. They noted that children born outside the village, even to Ayacucho parents, were sometimes able to speak, but often still displayed partial muteness. The results were inconclusive. Some concluded that the condition might be both hereditary and environmental, a complex interplay that eluded simple explanation. Despite the scientific intrigue, the theory of disease stirred fear within the village. Parents worried about the possibility of invisible contagions passing from mother to child. Midwives observed births with increased anxiety, checking for the first faint signs of life, listening for the cries that would never come. Every infant silence was a reminder of generations lost and a warning of the unknown forces that governed life in Ayacucho. Travelers and researchers debated the epidemic theory in letters and journals, speculating on what might have caused the village-wide muteness. Some suggested airborne pathogens. Others argued for nutritional or mineral deficiencies linked to the remote mountains. Every explanation seemed plausible yet incomplete, leaving Ayacucho as an enduring case study of human adaptation to mystery. Even with the possibility of disease, life continued in silence. Children were raised with care, parents communicated through gestures, and the community maintained its routines. Yet a shadow hung over every birth, a quiet dread that another child might inherit the voiceless fate of generations past. Every cradle became a test of survival, a silent echo of history's unresolved tragedies. The epidemic theory offered one potential path to understanding, but could not capture the full truth. It explained neither the richness of the village's culture nor the remarkable adaptability of its people. The silence, whether by curse, heredity, or disease, was more than a medical anomaly. It was a force shaping an entire society, defining how families loved, grieved, and survived. As decades passed, outsiders continued to study Ayacucho, theorizing, observing, and debating. Yet the village itself remained unchanged. Mountains loomed, winds whispered, and generations of silent children grew into silent adults. The epidemic theory remained just that, a theory, one of many attempts to explain a mystery that refused to yield. Though Ayacucho remained largely isolated, the outside world left its traces. Travelers, missionaries, and scholars ventured into the village and carried back accounts that mingled fascination, fear, and disbelief. These voices from the outside became the only way the world knew of Ayacucho's silent generations. Reports were vivid, often tinged with horror and wonder. One anthropologist described walking into the village square and seeing children chase goats, women carry water, and men tend fields, all in total silence. It was as if the world had forgotten to speak here, he wrote. Another noted the eerie feeling of being observed by hundreds of unspoken eyes, understanding gestures he could barely imitate. Letters sent to scientific journals detailed observations of birth rituals, childhood education, and family dynamics. Some researchers were enthralled by the ingenuity of silent communication, documenting hand signals, facial expressions, and body language as a complex, fully functioning language. Others were unnerved by the stillness, describing it as oppressive, almost unnatural. Missionaries and priests left written accounts as well. They struggled to minister in a village where prayer, confession, and hymn were rendered without sound. One priest recounted the difficulty of conveying spiritual lessons. How do you teach faith when your flock cannot speak? Yet their devotion is as deep as any I have witnessed. These observations hinted at a culture that thrived despite, perhaps because of, its voicelessness. Some travelers speculated that the village's isolation had preserved an ancient practice, a language of gestures lost elsewhere. Others fear that the silence was evidence of something darker, a curse or lingering epidemic. Every account was filtered through the observer's expectations, bias, and cultural lens, making it difficult to separate truth from interpretation. Newspapers occasionally printed stories of the voiceless village as curiosity pieces. Headlines claimed the town's children were born mute, cursed by the mountains, or silent as shadows. These articles attracted further visitors, some of whom sought answers, while others came simply to witness the phenomenon for themselves. The world outside Ayacucho was fascinated, frightened, and often sympathetic, but understanding remained elusive. Despite the influx of observers, life in Ayacucho changed little. The villagers adapted to new faces, new questions, and occasional experiments, but the silence remained. Visitors noted the resilience of the people, their creativity in communication, and the poignancy of their quiet lives. They left with detailed records, sketches, and journals, ensuring that the story of Ayacucho would echo far beyond the mountains. Yet, for every account recorded, the mystery deepened. Observers could describe what they saw, but they could not explain it. They could teach gestures, note patterns, and theorize endlessly, but they could not bring voice to the voiceless. The villagers themselves continued in their silent world, carrying forward a legacy untouched by time, observation, or curiosity. Even as reports circulated across continents, the mountains held their secret. The wind swept through Ayacucho's streets, unseen yet tangible, carrying a silence that no voice could break. And in that quiet, the villagers thrived, unknown and undisturbed, their lives a testament to endurance, adaptation, and the haunting power of a world without words. Decades passed, but Ayacucho remained a puzzle. The silent children grew into silent adults, and the cycle continued. Researchers, doctors, and travelers came and went, each leaving with notebooks full of observations, sketches, and questions, but no answers. The mountains kept their secret, as if guarding the village from the world beyond. By the mid-20th century, the phenomenon still defied explanation. Genetics, disease, curses, or divine intervention, every theory had flaws. No physical ailment could account for the absolute muteness. No environmental toxin had been conclusively identified. And while folklore provided rich narratives, it offered no concrete solution. The villagers' silence was total, persistent, and inexplicably inherited across generations. The human element was clear. Families continued to live, love, and mourn within the confines of silence. Children learned from their elders, carrying on rituals, traditions, and gestures that conveyed entire worlds of meaning. The community adapted, innovated, and endured, proving that life could thrive even under the strangest of constraints. But the emotional toll was ever present. Parents grieved silently for the words they would never hear. Children longed to call to one another with voices they did not possess. Visitors who stayed longer reported a haunting beauty. Life in Ayacucho was painstakingly coordinated, yet rich with intimacy. Hands told stories, eyes conveyed longing, and touch communicated devotion. In the absence of words, every gesture gained extraordinary significance. Observers noted that the village seemed to operate on a heightened level of awareness, empathy, and perception, skills sharpened by necessity. Even with centuries of study, outsiders still could not replicate or fully comprehend Ayacucho's reality. The silence was more than a lack of sound. It was a defining force shaping culture, family dynamics, and social structure. Each generation of children, born without voices, was both a continuation of history and a living question that science, superstition, and folklore could not answer. Letters, journals, and photographs preserved some of the story, but they were only fragments. The true experience of Ayacucho, the feeling of walking through its quiet streets, watching children play without a sound, witnessing ceremonies and daily life conducted entirely through gesture, remained beyond documentation. Even scholars admitted that their words fell short of capturing the essence of the village. The mountains loomed as eternal witnesses. Winds carried secrets through the valleys, and the peaks echoed with the lives of countless generations who had lived, loved, and died in silence. The Ayacucho Silence Study became legendary not because it provided answers, but because it confronted the limits of understanding itself. And so the mystery persists. Scholars continue to debate, and curiosity draws new visitors. Yet Ayacucho remains untouched. Children are born, families grow, and life continues, all in a world without voices. The silence is total, unbroken, and hauntingly beautiful, leaving the question forever suspended. Why does this village speak only through gestures, eyes, and the heart? Ayacucho whispers its secret to those who listen, but it refuses to speak aloud. And perhaps that is the most profound truth of all.